Hello and welcome to the MCQ lecture series. In today's class, I'll be dealing with multiple choice questions with respect to microeconomics, which is the economics special paper for SYBA. So let's get started. In the previous class, I've started with the MCQs with respect to chapter 2. In continuation of the same, let us look at some more MCQs. The first question in this lecture is regarding the laws, and it is stated like this. The law of dash states that marginal utility generated by additional units of a product or commodity diminishes as a consumer consumes more of it, holding constant the consumption of all the other commodities, or something called as ceteris paribus. So which law is talking about this, or which and this is the statement of which law? That means the marginal utility generated by additional units of a commodity tends to diminish as the consumer consumes more of it, holding constant the consumption of all other commodities. Whether it is law of diminishing marginal utility, whether it is law of equi-marginal utility, whether it is law of supply, or none of the above. So here it is pretty much clear that it is law of diminishing marginal utility, which states that as the consumer consumes more and more units of commodity, the additional utility generated by that particular commodity or product tends to diminish, holding constant the consumption of all the other commodities. And therefore option A, diminishing marginal utility, is correct. That means law of diminishing marginal utility states that the marginal utility generated by additional units or additional consumption of any product diminishes as the consumer consumes more of it, holding constant the consumption of all the other commodities, or something called as ceteris paribus in economics. I hope this question is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the second question, which is talking about the assumptions of this law, which is law of diminishing marginal utility. And let us look at what are the underlying options. The first is standard units of measurement. That means if at all I am looking at the consumption of ice creams, so therefore I have to make sure that the size of that particular cup which I am consuming remains the same throughout the consumption for marginal for the law of diminishing marginal utility to act or to be true. That means the size of the cup remains the same in all the successive consumptions. Second is with respect to homogeneity of the commodity. That means if at all I am consuming a particular commodity, ice cream, which was the example which I took, it has to be of the same flavor as well. So it has to be in that fashion. The next is with respect to continuous consumption. That means there should not be a time lag between successive consumptions. Then and then only the law of diminishing marginal utility holds true, and all of the above. So these are all in a sense talking about or denoting the assumptions of law of diminishing marginal utility. That means standard units of measurement, homogeneity of that particular commodity, as well as the continuous consumptions. That means there shouldn't be a time lag between successive consumptions, and therefore option D, all of the above, is the correct answer to this particular question. I hope the question is pretty much clear with respect to law of diminishing marginal utility. Let us now move to the next statement of a particular law and look at it. It is like this. The law of dash states that consumer will distribute his money income between the goods in such a way that the utility derived from the last rupee spent on each of the good is going to be equal or same. What do you call, or which law this statement is talking about? Whether it is talking about diminishing marginal utility, whether it is talking about equi-marginal utility, whether it is talking about law of demand or law of supply. So here it is pretty much clear that it is equi-marginal utility. So therefore the law of equi-marginal utility states that a consumer will distribute his money income between two goods in such a fashion or in such a manner that the utility derived from last rupee spent in each direction or on each good remains the same or equal. So therefore option B, equi-marginal utility, is the correct answer or correct option to this particular question. I hope the question is pretty much clear with respect to equi-marginal utility. What the consumer is doing, he is dividing or distributing his money income in such a fashion that the utility which he or she is going to derive from the last rupee spent on both these goods is going to be equal or same. That is what the consumer is doing in terms of law of equi-marginal utility. I hope the question is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the next question, which is talking about the limitations of law of equi-marginal utility. What are limitations to law of equi-marginal utility? The first option is talking about difficulty in measurement of marginal utility in terms of cardinal numbers. That means in terms of numbers, it is really difficult to measure the marginal utility. Thereafter, it is talking about consumer must weigh in his mind the utility which he or she is going to derive after the consumption of particular commodity. Thereafter, the last is with respect to indivisibility of certain goods. That means it is really difficult to divide certain goods, and therefore that is again a problem, and all of the above. So here, whenever we are looking at certain limitations, these are all limitations of law of equimarginal utility, because it is really difficult to measure utility in cardinal numbers. That is why we have something called as ordinal utility analysis, wherein you are ranking your preferences. There is an improvement over the previous version, which was cardinal utility analysis, and therefore it is difficult to measure it. Second of all, it is difficult for a human being to measure the marginal utility in his mind before the consumption of that particular commodity. And indivisibility of certain goods, it is really difficult for certain goods to be divided amongst or equally, or rather divisibility is really difficult. Therefore this is also a limitation to law of equimarginal utility, and therefore option D, all of the above, is the correct answer to this question, which is talking about the limitations to law of equimarginal utility. I hope both the law as well as its limitations are pretty much clear. Let us now move to the next question, which is talking about consumer's equilibrium or situation of consumer equilibrium in the marginal utility analysis or cardinal utility analysis. And the question is, in the marginal utility analysis or cardinal utility analysis, a consumer is said to be in equilibrium at a point where marginal utility of x to price of x is equal to marginal utility of y to price of y is equal to marginal utility of money. This is the first option. The second option is marginal utility of x to price of x is equal to marginal utility of y to price of y is not equal to marginal utility of money. The third condition is marginal utility of x to price of x is equal to marginal utility of y to price of y is greater than marginal utility of money, and none of the above. So now in marginal utility analysis or cardinal utility analysis, if at all a consumer wants to be in equilibrium, he has to satisfy this important condition. That means marginal utility of x to price of x, that ratio should be equal to marginal utility of y to price of y ratio, and both these things should be equal to marginal utility of money, and therefore this is the condition for consumer's equilibrium. I hope this question is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the next one. The next one is talking about what will happen if the prices of two commodities in question are same, then how the consumer will decide. So let us look at that. When the prices of two goods x and y are same, in order to maximize his satisfaction, the consumer will compare dash. He will compare A, the marginal utility of x and marginal utility of y. He will compare the ratio of marginal utility of x to price of x and marginal utility of y to price of y. His own money income he will probably look into or introspect, and none of the above. So here, whenever, please remember, whenever the prices of two goods x and y are same, in order to maximize his or her satisfaction, a consumer is always going to look at something called as this. That means he or she is going to compare the marginal utility he or she is going to derive from x and the marginal utility he or she is going to derive from the consumption of y, and according to that or accordingly he will adjust his consumption basket. So therefore, whenever the prices of two goods are same, in order to be in order to satisfy or maximize his satisfaction, the consumer will always look at the marginal utility values of these particular goods in question. That is, in our case it was good x and y, therefore marginal utility of x and marginal utility of y. I hope this question is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the next question. Now what will happen if at all the prices of the two goods in question are not same? Then how the consumer will maximize his satisfaction? So let us look at it, how the question is framed. When the prices of two goods x and y are not same, in order to maximize his satisfaction, the consumer will compare what? Whether he will compare marginal utilities of these two goods, that is marginal utility of x and marginal utility of y, whether he will compare the ratios of marginal utility of x to price of x and marginal utility of y to price of y, whether he will introspect or look into or compare his money income, and none of the above. So here in this case, now the consumer is going to compare this very important thing, that is the ratio of marginal utility of x upon price of x and marginal utility of y upon price of y. This is what he will compare between two goods and then decide how he is going to arrange his preferences, and therefore option B is the correct answer here, wherein when the prices are same, the consumer is comparing marginal utilities of X and Y. When the prices are not same, he is comparing or she is comparing marginal utility of X to price of X ratio with marginal utility of Y to price of Y ratio. I hope both these questions are pretty much clear. Very important questions with respect to the utility analysis. I hope these are clear. Let us now move to the last question in this segment, which is talking about one of the very important concepts as far as indifference curve analysis is concerned. First we understand this, and then we move towards something called as indifference curve analysis or ordinal utility analysis. And the question is, dash is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay, dash is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what he or she is actually paying. The difference between what he is willing to pay and what he is actually paying, what do you call that concept? Do you call it consumer's income? Do you call it consumer's surplus? Do you call it consumer's demand, or none of the above? So this concept is pretty important. It is called as consumer's surplus. That means the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what he actually ends up paying. That concept is called as consumer's surplus. So I hope the idea of consumer surplus is pretty much clear, and also this exercise of multiple choice questions with respect to the second chapter. In the upcoming lecture, I'll be covering questions with respect to the same chapter, but I'll cover in greater details indifference curve analysis or utility analysis with the help of ordinal method. So please stay tuned for more. Thank you.